Her signature on the forged permit and her offer of a bribe were being compiled into a full report. Whether it would end in fines, jail time, or just public disgrace didn't matter to me. She had lost everything she used to control this neighborhood, and the people who once followed her now crossed the street to avoid her shadow. One morning I was out checking the edge of the field when a Homeland technician arrived with a small device he said would boost signal integrity underground. While he worked, he asked me how long I'd been leasing the land. I told him about the first contract, the reasons behind it, and how I used to joke with my dad that the corn wasn't just for harvest but for hiding things. He smiled and said it made sense. Fields like mine were useful precisely because they were ordinary. Nobody suspected a field. Until someone like Karen comes along with too much ambition and not enough sense. After he left, I looked out over the land. The scars from the bulldozer were still there, but grass was already sprouting in the cracks. Nature doesn't forgive, but it does move on. I stood in silence for a while, thinking about what the next phase of this story would be. The battle was mostly over, but the consequences were still rippling through town. The HOA was still trying to figure out how to explain everything to the residents. Karen hadn't spoken publicly. And me, I had a new lease signed, a safer field, and a town full of people who had finally stopped calling me the weird old man with the corn and started calling me sir. It wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about boundaries, about standing your ground even when nobody stands with you, and about letting people like Karen talk themselves into a corner so deep they forget where the exit is. The sound of tractors returned to my land, but this time they weren't tearing things down, they were helping put it back together. A small team of contractors hired through a Homeland contact arrived with quiet precision and high-grade equipment. They didn't wear uniforms and didn't ask for coffee. They got right to work removing the last of the gravel and rebuilding the topsoil layer by layer like they were restoring a museum exhibit instead of a cornfield. I watched from the porch, and for the first time in weeks I didn't feel like I had to guard the land. These folks respected it even if they didn't know the full story. A few days into the repairs, the agents asked if I'd be open to hosting a small event on the property, something to mark the completion of upgrades and to offer goodwill to the neighborhood. I was hesitant at first. I didn't want the field turned into a photo op or worse, another excuse for the HOA to pretend nothing happened. But the agent assured me it would be low-key and only for those directly involved. A controlled setting. No press. Just a few folding chairs, a table with refreshments, and some of the folks who had worked behind the scenes to keep the mess from becoming a full-blown disaster. I agreed under one condition. No Karen. The morning of the gathering arrived under a soft sky with a light breeze and the kind of calm that had been missing since the first bulldozer arrived. A few government SUVs pulled in quietly, followed by 2 pickup trucks from the local community support team. They helped set up a tent and arrange chairs in the newly restored clearing. The same spot where Karen had stood weeks earlier barking orders at a man in a hard hat now held a table with lemonade and a basket of muffins brought in by Barbara. It felt surreal. Among the guests were Agent Harris and 2 of the technicians who had helped repair the node system buried beneath the field. Dave showed up in a clean polo shirt carrying a folding lawn chair and that sheepish expression he always wore when he wasn't sure if he was still on thin ice. I waved him over and offered a seat. He thanked me and said he had officially stepped down from the HOA board. Said he'd had enough of politics and bylaws and wanted to spend more time with his grandkids instead of untangling Karen's messes. Barbara arrived a little later with her husband in tow. She brought a small gift bag with a card inside thanking me for my patience and for not turning my back on the neighborhood even when they had turned theirs on me. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and said thanks. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about knowing the other person finally gets it. The event lasted less than 2 hours, but it shifted the tone of everything. There were no speeches, no cameras, no forced apologies. Just quiet gratitude and a shared sense that maybe the neighborhood had learned something. Maybe. As the sun began to dip lower, I stood near the edge of the field watching the wind ripple through the newly planted seedlings, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not pride. Not victory. Just peace. That evening I walked the perimeter of the field alone. The new soil lines were smooth, the fencing had been reinforced, and the access hatch had been disguised even better than before. It looked like part of the irrigation system, now a seamless piece of machinery that no one would glance at twice. The red tape was gone, replaced with internal motion sensors and encrypted relay systems that connected silently to wherever it all led. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. Back at the house, I found a letter in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a short typed note informing me that my cooperation had been noted and my service appreciated. Enclosed was an updated lease summary with a substantial increase in annual compensation and an emergency contact line that bypassed every switchboard. I didn't smile, I just folded it neatly and slid it into the file cabinet next to my original agreement. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. The next few days passed without incident. No HOA cars parked near the lot. No meetings, no complaints, no passive-aggressive emails about lawn height or mailbox paint. The silence felt earned this time. One afternoon I saw a few neighborhood kids riding their bikes past my gate, and I heard one of them whisper something about the spy corn guy. I chuckled under my breath and let them think whatever they wanted. At least they weren't afraid of me anymore. Later that week I drove into town for supplies and overheard two women at the diner counter discussing Karen's house. One said she'd seen a moving truck. The other said Karen was leaving town for good, maybe going to stay with her sister out west. I didn't know if it was true, but the thought of it felt like the last page in a book finally turning. No final speech, no confrontation, no vindication scene. Just quiet departure. That's the thing about people like Karen. They build their power out of borrowed fear, and when no one's afraid anymore, there's nothing left to stand on. I spent that evening on the porch watching the sunset sink behind the tree line, casting golden streaks across the sky. The corn hadn't sprouted yet, but I could picture it already tall, strong, and hiding more than it showed. The field was whole again. The neighborhood was quieter. And for once I felt like I wasn't standing alone. Not because people had changed overnight, but because the ground beneath my feet was finally protected, not just by law but by consequence. As the wind rustled through the trees, I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and thought about how strange life could be. A cornfield. A parking lot. A federal lease. An HOA president brought down not by force but by her own ambition. I hadn't planned any of it. I hadn't even wanted it. But sometimes the world hands you a shovel and you either dig your heels in or get buried. I chose the first option. And I'd do it again. The letter arrived without fanfare, slipped into my mailbox between a seed catalog and a water bill. It was cream-colored with a federal seal embossed in one corner and no return address. I opened it slowly, expecting more paperwork, maybe another update about my lease or security upgrade. But it was short, just 2 paragraphs. The investigation into HOA activities was complete and Karen Blanchfield had been found in violation of multiple federal ordinances, including unauthorized destruction of government infrastructure and attempted bribery of a federal witness. Charges were being formally filed, and her cooperation, or lack thereof, had been noted. The final sentence read that I would not be called to testify unless additional circumstances required. I folded it neatly and placed it in the drawer with the rest of the file. I didn't need a court appearance or headlines. Justice had its own rhythm, and this time it had moved like a quiet storm, steady, unrelenting, and unseen until it hit. Word spread fast through the neighborhood, but not from me. Barbara was the first to knock that afternoon, holding a plate of cookies and a nervous smile. She didn't ask for details. Just said she heard Karen was leaving town for good and that the board had formally removed her name from all records and meeting notes. Dave came by the next day with a handshake and an apology for the second time this month. He said they were holding a final community meeting and asked if I would attend. Not to speak, he said, just to be there. To show them things were done for real this time. I showed up a few minutes after it started wearing the same flannel shirt I'd worn when Karen first ordered my field destroyed. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. The meeting was quieter than usual, no coffee, no snacks, just folding chairs, and a printed agenda with a lot of blank space. Barbara opened the meeting with a moment of silence, not for anyone lost but for the mistakes made by people who thought rules didn't apply to them. No one mentioned Karen by name, but they didn't have to. Her absence filled the room louder than her voice ever had. Dave took the floor and spoke about rebuilding trust, repairing community ties, and respecting private property lines. He said they would no longer pursue any changes to land zoning without full community consensus and a vote. He also recommended that the HOA donate part of its remaining funds to a local veterans support group as a gesture of restitution. That caught me off guard. I didn't say anything, but I made a mental note to follow up. If they were sincere about it, I'd offer to match their donation. Not because I had to, but because it felt right. After the meeting, I walked back through the neighborhood alone, watching porch lights flicker on and dogs bark behind fences. It felt different this time. Not because the houses had changed, but because the air was clearer. Like something heavy had been lifted from the soil. Back at home, I poured a cup of coffee and sat by the window watching the wind ripple across the young corn plant. They were growing fast and straight, as if even they sensed the storm had passed. A few mornings later, I got another visitor, not from the neighborhood this time. It was a man in a plain gray suit with a badge clipped inside his coat. He introduced himself as a liaison from the Department of Homeland Security. Said he'd been monitoring the case and wanted to personally thank me for my discretion and cooperation. He handed me a sealed envelope with a new ID badge and a formal designation. Nothing dramatic, just a line of text confirming my role as a protected contractor with renewed clearance. He said it came with certain privileges and extended protections should anything like this ever happen again. I thanked him and asked how deep this had gone. He smiled and said deep enough that it wouldn't happen again. Then he tipped his hat and left. Later that week I sat at my desk and wrote a letter. Not to a lawyer or an agent, but to the local paper. I didn't sign my name. I just wrote about what had happened in broad strokes, how one person's hunger for control almost cost the town more than they realized. I didn't mention Homeland Security or permits or buried conduit. I just told a story about a man with a cornfield and a neighbor who thought she owned the sun. The editor published it under the title "The Price of Paving Over Route." It got shared more than I expected. Some folks even stopped me in town to talk about it. Not in a dramatic way. Just a quiet nod of understanding, like they'd finally looked at their own fences and saw something worth respecting. By the end of the month, Karen's house was listed for sale. The sign went up in the front yard with a local agent's number, and the porch lights finally turned off. Nobody ever saw her pack. Some said she left in the middle of the night. Others said she moved in with her sister 2 states over. I didn't care. She was gone. And that was enough. I went back to my usual routine, tending the soil, watching the crops rise, marking the days by sunrise and the sound of wind through the trees. I didn't need more excitement. I didn't want it. The land was whole again, the lease secure, and the town quieter. Even the HOA meetings stopped sending out those overly cheerful newsletters with clip art and exclamation points. They got shorter, more honest, and more focused on actual neighborhood concerns like drainage and sidewalk repairs. It wasn't thrilling, but it was real. And that's all I ever wanted. One evening I stood at the edge of the field, as the sun sank low behind the tree line, casting gold across the soil. I took off my hat, ran a hand over my forehead, and let the quiet settle over me like a blanket. No more bulldozers. No more shouting. Just the sound of the world turning slowly and the soft rustle of corn that would keep growing long after everyone forgot the name Karen Blanchfield. I didn't win. There was no scoreboard, no trophy, no headline. But I still had my land, my peace, and the knowledge that sometimes you don't have to fight with fists or fury. Sometimes you just have to stand firm long enough for the storm to wear itself out. and when the dust settles and the last lie fades, you'll still be their boots in the dirt hands, steady eyes on the horizon waiting for the next season to begin.